On the eve of our struggle for independence, a man who might have been one of the greatest among the founding fathers, Dr. Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Congress, said to his fellow Americans, "Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question upon which rests the happiness and the liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves." Well, I believe we, the Americans of today, are ready to act worthy of ourselves, ready to do what must be done to ensure happiness and liberty for ourselves, our children, and our children's children. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is made up of men and women who raise our food, patrol our streets, man our mines and factories, teach our children, keep our homes, and heal us when we're sick. Professionals, industrialists, shopkeepers, clerks, cabbies, and truck drivers. They are, in short, we the people. Their patriotism is quiet but deep. Their values sustain our national life. With the idealism and fair play which are the core of our system and our strength, we can have a strong and prosperous America at peace with itself and the world. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We will again be the exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Close, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rugged red glare, the bombs burst
Amen. I really hope today is not just one gigantic history lesson. I am going to go over basically the whole concept of how we became a nation and why we became a nation. Now, I'm not really doing it because it's 4th of July, although it happens to land on a really good day to do this, okay? And here's the reason why I want to share what I want to share is because if we don't understand the root of why we do what we do, we can never uproot something or unbind ourselves from something. Does that make sense? Our series is called Unbound. And the reality is, if I ask you to unbind yourself, you have to say from what? Right? Is there anybody following me today? Yes? Thank you. All right. From what? What do I have to be unbound from? And that becomes the bigger question. Last week we talked about who sits on the throne of your heart. Because whoever sits on the throne of your heart gets to dictate everything about your life, your direction, your attitude. And so we have to say who sits on your throne. Now I said who or what last week because I can't say who or what. You have to decide who or what that is. And so today, if we're going to talk about being unbound from some of the worldly things that we do, and we have to know what are some of those things that we do and why do we do the things that we do. And if you guys start to look into some of the scripture, Paul says it the best, and it's one of the most confusing scriptures ever because he uses the word do over and over again. And he says, I do the things that I do, and I don't know why I do the things that I do, but I don't want to do the things that I do, but I still do the things that I do. And you're like, what? This is where English is like, come on, guys, we should have did something better there, right? But the reality is I want to kind of get us into that mindset of why we do what we do. I mean, you're sitting in a church today. Why? What's the point? And so, therefore, I want to kind of walk into that. Is that okay? All right. If it gets too boring, just kind of start nodding at me. Do the Baptist nod, and I'll just be like, okay, I got this, okay? And then we'll move. And then some of you guys are going to be doing that and think I'm bored. And you're like, oh, no, I'm just agreeing. And this is going to be really awkward. Okay. With that said, 1517. Boom, AD, in case you guys were wondering. 1517. Acting on his belief, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., a different one, okay? Martin Luther wrote the disputation on the powers of efficiency of indulgence, C's, also known as the 95 Thesis. Some of you guys have heard this before, okay? Now, this basically what it was a list of questions and propositions for debate in the Catholic Church. Why did he have to do this? Because in the Catholic Church at that time, they were so powerful that they basically dictated what was going on in the land. Now, this was a problem because they started doing things that were not proper. And the reason they started doing the things that were not proper, or in this case, biblical, was because they wanted money and they wanted status. Did that make sense? And so therefore, if you were a hierarchy in the Catholic Church at that time, you were set. You were almost equal to kings and queens. Are you following me on this one? The problem is that there's some of these things that they were doing that were not good. You guys with me on this one? You're like, what kind of things weren't good, Craig? Oh, that's easy. One of them, that's a big one that you guys will all know of, is you could pay them a fee. They will pray for your dead relative to get into heaven. Did that make sense? So you're like, oh, dude, Grandpa didn't make it, right? So you go up to the bishop and you go up to and you look at him and you're like, hey, listen, can you pray for my dead grandpa so that he can get into heaven? They're like, yeah, well, how sinful was he? I'm like, it's going to be like $100. You know what I mean? And you give him $100 and boom, grandpa gets into heaven. Did that make sense? That is so not biblical in any way, shape, or form. We get one chance, right? And we have to make that decision. But the problem is they weren't doing that. There also gets into some of the churches. I'm not going to get into this a ton because it's not really the bigger point. But some of the things that Catholicism was doing at that time is they were basically trying to keep people away from the scriptures. And they were telling people that they were not holy enough and they weren't basically good enough to read the scriptures because they couldn't interpret it right and they couldn't do it. So what they did is when they separated that, you just had to go off the faith of basically the Pope at the time and all the cardinals and all the bishops at the time, in this case the priests at each parish, and you'd have to say they are actually telling you what's in the Bible. Did that make sense? And so what started to happen is they can now basically do, and this is where they became correct because they had all this power. They could literally say, oh, Isaiah chapter 5 says you must give me like $15, all of you, right now. And you didn't know any better. And you're just like, man, the Lord is very money hungry for some reason. I say that on purpose because not much has changed. Because when you talk about the church today, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Christian, a lot of people will say one thing about the church is they always want my money. Did that make sense? But this is a deep-seated root that goes all the way back to our beginnings in Catholicism. Does that make sense? Now, in case you guys are all wondering, Catholicism is not bad. They're basically our forefathers. Does this make sense? See, what happened is this. Honestly, if Martin Luther didn't exist, we probably would still be at a Catholic church at this point. Does this make sense? If the Catholic Church never became corrupt, we would probably still be sitting in a parish right now and going and having a priest give us the communion and all that kind of stuff. Did that make sense? The reality why is because Martin Luther, when he saw these things, he called out the corruption, and the legend has it that on October 31st, what's October 31st? Yeah. In 1517, Luther defiantly nailed a copy of his 95 Thesis to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Walked up and was like, ha ha, bam, take that, Catholics. Are you following me on this one? Knowing that the second that he posted this, he was excommunicated from the church and he would be banned. Basically, everybody's not going to like him. Did this make sense? Everybody with me on this one? In case you guys are wondering, today or this year is 2017. It'll be 500 years since the Reformation this October 31st. I hope something good happens. Okay? Maybe another Reformation. All right, so. And I'll explain why I say that in a second. Okay. So now, after I tell you all of this, this should be your natural question, right? Boom. Should be the natural question. Okay, that was like 500 years ago. What does that have to do with me today? Here's the reason why. You are in this church today because of that man's passion for truth and justice against the tyrannical tirades of the Catholic Church at the time. That document split the church, causing a reformation that created the Protestant movement, which you know today as Christianity. Christianity was not really back in that day. You were Catholic. Does that make sense? Before you were Catholic, you were Jewish. Are you following me on that one? See, the reality becomes we have these segregations right now. We think that we're fighting against each other when we shouldn't actually be fighting against each other. We have the same God and the same Savior, and we need to start looking not at our differences, but more at who we are as people. Did that make sense? You know, like right up the street right here, we got St. Peter, St. Paul, right? I don't think the people going to St. Peter and St. Paul are going to hell. Does that make sense? I'm not sitting here going, ooh, we need to pray that direction. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's not happening. Like, those are our brothers. Those are our sisters. They have a different way of doing church than we do, and that's still okay. Does this make sense? The reality becomes it's a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and I've heard them preach it. Does that make sense? And it becomes to us, do we have a personal, because just you could be sitting here today and still burning in hell, just like they could be sitting in their parish and burning in hell there too. The reality starts to become, what kind of relationship do you have? What Martin Luther was saying, look, we got to get back to the biblical basics. Can we get back to Bible? Can we get back to what the Scripture says? Can we do it? Now, I am giving you cliff notes on cliff notes, really fast version of this. Does this make sense? I encourage all of you. I literally encourage all of you. Go research this stuff. Go research it, because it will help you in your walk with Christ, and it will help you see people in a different light. Does this make sense? Now, I do have to say there are other churches, like the Catholic and Christians and all that kind of stuff, that don't preach the right stuff. And you have to watch out for that. And Jesus tells us about it constantly. Does that make sense? Everybody still with me? Yes. We're walking. Yes? No? Yeah. All right, next. Now we get into the fun, kind of boring, maybe, stuff. So with Martin Luther nailing this to the thing, starts to divide churches, people start to think like, well, what, they're not supposed to do that? Oh, I didn't know that. And then there's that one guy that's like, Grandpa. So good, there's 3 people following me on that one. Okay. The kings and queens ruling over England had a difference of opinions on what church to follow, and thus each king and queen that ruled over England, you got a different set of rules. Does this make sense? So you got to remember, this is starting to take place over a period of time, and what's happening is you have these rulers that come and go. Okay, like you're going to have King George III, Elizabeth I, and all this kind of stuff. Elizabeth I is going to be your main person because she's very a big advocate for the Catholic Church, and she wants basically England to go back to its roots, which was Catholicism. Did that make sense? Because the king prior to her did not was just like, hey, let's follow this Christian ways, let's try to do this, and she tried to bring it all back. Did that make sense? That's where you started to get persecution against Christians, or against these people that were doing it, these Protestants. Everybody with me on this one? That's where Queen Elizabeth I is also the one, if I recall correctly, she's also the one that basically started throwing people in jail, that if you didn't actually follow Catholicism and you started going to different churches and all that kind of stuff, or doing a different way of church, I should explain, then you got tossed in jail for a time period. Everybody with me on this one? Okay, the last thing I put this occurs imprisonment and embarrassment. Why did I put imprisonment and embarrassment? Because most of the time they were actually taken out and they were embarrassed. Like they would either, like there's stories that they would be tarred and feathered. There's stories of them being in the stockades and all this kind of stuff, just because they didn't want to go to a Catholic church. Did that make sense? And at that time, it's a cathedral. Like, who wouldn't want to go to one of those nowadays, right? How times have changed, right? Like, you're just like, have you seen? They're beautiful. Let's go hang. No, not. And the acoustics, amazing. Justin, you would have a ball. All right, next. England figured out, but during this time, there was something that England started to figure out. England figured out that Spain was striking it rich in the West because some guy named Columbus accidentally found the Americas. The South Americas, okay? And he was bringing in tons of gold, so they started to send colonists. Now, some of you guys know this from U.S. history, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah. That's... Thanks, Mom. So here's how it works. Now, obviously, 1492 and 1517 is obviously difference, right? Well, you got to remember, it wasn't just a hop, skip, and a jump to get over to the Americas. I mean, you had to load a boat, you had to do this, and let's say you started on the boat with 100 people, you got probably 20 when you arrived, okay? It was like a roll of the dice, okay? It's like, you know what, I hate it so much here that I'm going to try and survive the long journey to the Americas. Now, as you guys know, reading Christopher Columbus and all the stuff that we know, he obviously didn't land on Plymouth Rock. He didn't walk into, the East Coast and was like, this is, he basically landed on a bunch of islands, okay? Then he actually started a trek, not north, but he actually started a trek inland, which is where he got to the top of South America. This is where he found tons of gold, tons of riches, and he started bringing it back to Spain, and Spain was like, ha-ha, rolling. Do you know what I mean? England now looks at that and goes, whoa, time out. We want to do the same thing. So they start sending colonists over to North America. Now, the French are doing the same thing, but they're not as popular. The French do something absolutely, I just find this to be absolutely fascinating. The French didn't come in trying to take over. The French came in actually partnering with the Native Americans. Did you guys know this? the French really started to partner with the Native Americans, which is the only reason why we actually kind of like win like the Revolutionary War, because that's where they come into play, because the French are like, we got our butt kicked by England, so therefore we want to go and like revenge, we'll help you out. And they got the Indians to actually fight with the colonists against England. Anyways, that's sidetrack. I just found that to be fascinating because they had a different approach to it. They said, let's come in and partner, where we came in and said, this is ours now. Does this make sense? Now, there was a bunch of this. The Spaniards tried to go up, and Spain tried to go up. They tried to make colonies. Nothing worked, okay? Nothing started to work. Is everybody still walking with me in this one? Yeah, are you sure? What's wrong? What are you? Okay.
You don't look at the front row.
I know. This is why I don't look at the front row. 1585. Boom. Yeah, 1585. Sir Walter Raleigh established the first colony on Roanoke Island on what is now known as North Carolina. He landed on an island and he said, this is going to be the new America. This is going to be the new England. We are going to be so awesome here. It didn't last long. They think that maybe a year, less than a year. And this is the creepiest thing ever. The whole colony disappeared without a trace, and the only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. Now that's a good movie, right? Like that, no joke. Now, what we find out later is that the word Croatoan, okay, is actually an Indian tribe, a Native American tribe. And so they started to figure out that later. But could you imagine showing up and being like, hey, where is everybody? Oh, this is creepy. And it's just like carved into a tree, like some name that you don't even know, you can't even read. You know what I mean? You're like, all right, let's go south. So this colony actually didn't work at all. So it doesn't even count as a colony because it didn't last. It doesn't make sense. But it was the first attempt, and Sir Walter Raleigh, good job. That's why you have what? Raleigh, North Carolina. Everybody cool with that? No? All right, history is fun. There's another one, 1587. The Profam colony near Maine was established. Within 1 year, was completely wiped out by disease and Native Americans. Literally, go ahead and check that out. That's all you're going to get. They're like, yeah, we think they died. But nobody knows where they went. Okay? And then, third time's a charm, everybody. We loaded up a boat, sent out colonists, and we established in Virginia the very first colony everybody knows as Jamestown. You guys said good. Some of you guys paid attention in school. That's good. In 1607, 100 colonists landed in Virginia to establish Jamestown. The success only came because of the export of tobacco and the introduction of the African slaves. Here's why that is important. Some of the things that you will read on Jamestown is this. They established basically this rule. You don't work, you won't eat. Working is literally what got people to basically become established. There's so many people that they just got so tired and they got so weak, they stopped working. When you stop working, you become dead weight. Does this make sense? Now, obviously, Jamestown, you're going to have some famous people in there. You're going to have Captain John Smith. You guys know John Smith? Like, he came out to be like some really like awesome guy. Not so much in history. The next slide. Let's see where I was going with this. England did all of this in search of wealth. This had nothing to do with the exploration or expansion of territory. Matter of fact, majority of the Jamestown colonists were goldsmiths and jewelers. When they found out they had to actually farm, Captain John Smith said, and I quote, are you ready? "We would rather starve than farm." And they were on the first boat back to England. But the Indians there, the Native Americans, if you will, showed them this thing called tobacco and how to farm it, how to make crops of it. And it turned out in England, they loved the stuff. Loved it. Now, the king hated it, but the people loved it. And this was the one place that they can actually do an export. Did this make sense? Remember, it was founded off of the idea, I want to get rich quick. I'm just going to send a bunch of people over there. You guys start digging in the land, and when you find like enormous boulders of gold, just send it back our way. That's why they sent goldsmiths and jewelers out there, because they were supposed to refine the gold, put it into bricks, and send it back. But when they found out there was no gold over there, they were on the wrong coast, okay? What started to happen is people started to die off. Are you guys with me on this one? Jamestown is the very first colony that was established. Now, not far behind them becomes something else, and this is where it gets really interesting. You have to remember this: Jamestown is not America. Jamestown is an industry, okay, by the Virginia Company that was literally exporting tobacco back to England. Did you guys catch that? Matter of fact, they didn't have any infrastructure. They didn't have really any rules or laws. They really didn't have anything. All they had was lots of land that was growing tobacco. Did everybody catch this? So they even though they were a colony because people colonized there, they really honestly were not setting out to be like, let's establish America. Does that make sense? All they were worker bees sending honey back home. Everybody got it? There was another group that came through, and this is where it gets super interesting, okay? 1610, people started arriving north of Virginia in Massachusetts and in Maine. These people were known as the Puritans. Now, you have to understand something. There is a difference between Puritans and Pilgrims. Everybody still walking with me on this? Okay, moving forward. Okay, Puritans. The thought that the Protestant church was still too Catholic in England, and with all of its traditions, the stand-up, the sit-down, the incense, and the extravagantly living archbishops. They fled to the west to escape persecution from Queen Elizabeth I. They were also called the Congregationalists. They were not called Puritans. The reason like Puritans was like that, like making fun of them. Did that make sense? They're like, oh, you're a Puritan. And they're like, no, I'm a Congregationalist. Are you guys with me on that one? But you got to put it in an English accent, and that's really hard, okay? That's why they're like Puritans. Okay, so anyways, that's where they come from. The Puritans are there. Move next slide. It says this, Puritans equals Congregationalists. They thought the congregations should determine leadership and worship structures, not bishops. This should sound very familiar to you. Yes? No? Maybe? Because this is the structure of the church. Remember I said that there are roots that go deep, and if we're going to try and unbind things, we need to know where the roots, where they started from. Congregationalists had this idea that basically the group of people should decide who should be their pastor and what kind of style of worship that they should be doing. Obviously, all under the context of the scriptures. Did that make sense? Everybody still walking with me on this one? Okay, next. Okay, this is actually the most famous sermon in America, and probably majority of you don't know it. Okay? I'll just be real, okay? Because we don't teach this in school, because we don't allow things. So the Puritans had this man that came over. He was a lawyer. He was obviously going to be Massachusetts governor once this all gets established. But he had this thought process, and he said, look, if we have to do something, otherwise we're all going to die. Does this make sense? So this is what he said. This is a little bit long, but I want to share this with you because I think it's very prevalent. To provide for our prosperity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must intertwine each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves to our superfluity. Excess, okay? For the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberty. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. Did you guys get that part? Stronger. You get stronger. Okay? We shall find that God of Israel is among us. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in his work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. But if our hearts shall turn away, so that we will not obey, but shall succeed. That's the word I was looking for. And worship other gods, our pleasure and profits, and serve them. It is propounded upon us this day that we shall surely perish out of the good land whither we pass over this vast sea to possess it. Therefore, let us choose life, that we and our seed may live by obeying his voice and cleaving to him, for he is our life and our prosperity. This is called The Model of Christian Clarity by John Winthrop. 16. What? Charity. Oh, I'm sorry. What did I say? Charity. What did I say? Tomato. No, I'm just kidding. John Winthrop, 1630. Basically, if you guys, as I was reading, I told you guys it was a little longer. I wanted you to hear that because it is literally one of the most famous sermons in America. And most of the time we don't even know what it is. And basically what he's saying is we need to work together. You guys saw all the Bible verses up in there, didn't you? You start to read City on a Hill, you start seeing all these things. It is much longer than that. I just took excerpts from it, so that way you guys can basically kind of understand where they were at. So when they landed in Massachusetts, what they were saying as Puritans is we need to band together. And the next slide, I don't remember the next slide. Oh yeah, in other words, the Puritans had this one thought: the needs of many outweigh the needs of a few. Thus, socialism was born. Basically, the idea becomes this: if we don't band together, we won't survive. Did you guys catch that? If we don't band together, then we won't survive. If we don't band together, we won't survive. And this becomes the model of the Christian church. Why? It was out of necessity. Did that make sense? The model still stands today, but now the model starts to break down. Why? Because the model that we have in America today is not band together because it's the only way we can survive. The model today is me and my own. Does this make sense? So therefore you have people that sit back and say, I don't need the church, I got God, I got a Bible at home, what do I need the church for? The problem becomes, as you have that relationship with God, we neglect the gathering together of people. We neglect basically, I want to say the community. We neglect the community. Does that make sense? And so what happens is we actually start to push the church away and we come up with these falsehoods. But where does this come from? Where does gathering together come from? It comes from the necessity, basically in this day and age, or in the Puritans' life, if we don't band together, we all die. Did that make sense? Well, we don't have that today, so then why meet? What's the point? Does it make sense? Yeah. I'm going to leave that hanging for you. All right. You're like, well, what's the answer? The reality starts to become for you, if you really want to know the answer, you're going to have to search your heart. Because I actually don't think it's any different. Even though culture has changed and society has changed, you go try living on your own in this world. If you're trying to tell me that it can be done, I disagree. We need people. People need people. We were created for community. Church is a necessity still. And if we don't have it, we perish. I really believe that. That's my view. Next. Now you have the pilgrims. Pilgrims. I'm almost done, don't worry. Some of you guys are like, oh no, pilgrims, you gotta do the whole thing with pilgrims? They didn't have anything fancy to write, so okay. They wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. They went to the Netherlands first, but they found out they were too corrupt, so they went to Virginia, okay? Or west to Virginia. They got blown off course and ended up in Massachusetts, where they established the colony of Plymouth. This is where we get Thanksgiving. Everybody okay with that? Okay? And if you guys don't know the story of Thanksgiving, just look up Squanto and you guys will be okay, okay? That is just the coolest name. I don't know why. It's so much fun. Squanto is awesome. All right, moving forward to the next thing. You know more about the Pilgrims, not from their religious belief, but because of something they created on their boat before they landed in America. The Mayflower Compact. You guys remember this? Like back in like 4th grade? 5th grade? I don't know when they teach it nowadays. Now, basically what they decided is they basically said that we are going to have just and equal laws, and they're going to choose representatives that would write these laws, thus creating a form of democracy and a government before they even landed. This is why it is so important. So when they landed, are you guys with me? When they landed, they basically said, we already made rules, we already understand this, and we're going to basically govern this. Does this make sense? Therefore, starting to create something that a lot of the colonies were just trying to figure out and develop. Did that make sense? But they already had things ready to go, right? Way to go, Pilgrims. Okay? Everybody with me on this one? The problem is if you guys don't know the story, when they landed basically 4 weeks before the worst storm ever on the East Coast. And basically, they almost died if it wasn't for Squanto and all those guys, bringing in the Indians and having them, or the Native Americans, having them help them out and doing all this stuff. They literally lost more than half of their people. Are you guys with me on this one? But they still got saved and basically created Plymouth. Everybody still with me? Now, remember, I said Massachusetts twice now. So you have the Puritans that are in Massachusetts in that area, and then you have the Pilgrims that basically are in Massachusetts, but they're kind of more towards the Bay Area. Does that make sense? So you got the two different places. Next, okay. In 1630, Puritans from Massachusetts joined forces with the Pilgrims of Plymouth, creating the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Everybody with me on this one? This is why Puritans and Pilgrims are considered to be the same. Got it? Because they actually joined forces, and here's why they joined forces. They set up gathered churches on much of the same model as the church at Plymouth, with deacons, preaching elders, and a communion restricted to full church members or saints. This is where it gets weird and corrupt. Deacons. You know that there's churches that have deacons, right? Elders. We know churches have elders. Communion. No churches do communion. But you're not allowed to take communion unless you're actually a full member of the church. And in order to be a full member of the church, you have to be a saint. Well, you got to remember where they're coming from. You guys remember where they're coming from? The Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church, a saint is somebody that's like, woo, like, you know what I mean? Way up there. Like, you got to do miracles, 3 of them to be exact. Does that make sense? Like, you got to do these things. And then, it's not just a saint. They actually go to the term visible saint. You have to be a visible saint. So what in the world does that mean? Oh, yeah, by the way, this is where you're going to get your Episcopalians and your Presbyterians. Okay? This is where that church splitting starts to happen. Does that make sense? Hey, next slide. Boom. Saints. In order to vote, you had to be a church member, a saint. Remember? You have to be a saint. So in order to vote on anything, you have to be a church member. Okay? In order to be a church member, you had to be a visible saint, which is a person who had a conversion experience, made a public profession of faith, and has the worldly success. Has the worldly success which confirms membership in the elect that Paul talks about. Did that make sense? So if you poor, you ain't getting into heaven. Did that make sense? Everybody with me on this one? Okay? This is not a new thought process. This actually comes from John Calvin. This is a Calvinistic thought process. Did that make sense? The early Calvinistic thought process. The elect becomes those that go into heaven, which means this. If you weren't rich, and you didn't take communion, you can't be a part of the church, or you can't be a member of the church. You can go to the church, but you're not a member. And because you're not a member, you can't vote. Guess what they already established? They already established this thing where you get to vote. Majority of the people didn't get to vote. So those empowered stayed in power. And now we have Catholicism all over again, starting in the States. Did you catch that? It's really a power grab at this point. Everybody still walking with me on this one? Okay. Next slide. Boom. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, although extremely religious, became corrupt very fast, but they weren't all bad. See, they wanted everyone to read the Bible, so they invented these things called schools. You guys want to know where schools come from? Massachusetts, way back in the day because of the period. And literally, I'm not joking with you, what they would do is they would teach people how to read the Bible. That was the entire design of schools back in the day. Just to read the Bible. I mean, we're so close there now, right? Where children would go to learn how to read scriptures. We also get this woman named Anne Hutchinson. Has anybody ever heard of Anne Hutchinson? If you haven't, women, read up Anne Hutchinson. Guys, know Anne Hutchinson, okay? Here's who Anne Hutchinson is. Okay, boom, next slide. Anne Hutchinson arrived in 1634 with John Cotton. They had a scripture-centered, spirit-centered theology and challenged the religious establishment by arguing that membership should be based off of inner grace, not outward manifestations. Like how many times you go to church. That make sense? Everybody with me on this one? Welcome, charismatics. Okay? She was banished from the colony and excommunicated from the church in 1638. She died in 1643 in New York by an Indian or Native American attack. That makes sense? But she was the first woman to basically stand up. But now here's a cool thing. Why do we know about Anne Hutchinson? Why is this even a big thing? She kept a diary, a document, a journal. And I would encourage you guys to look some of this stuff up because she actually starts to give what we see in the church today as what a spirit-led church looks like. Does this make sense? Everybody with me on this one? Next, okay, in 1650, the Religious Society of Friends, that's really what they called themselves, they thought that was good. The Religious Society of Friends, whose members are commonly known as Quakers. You guys have heard of the Quakers? Not the guy on the little oatmeal box, okay. Was a Christian movement founded by George Fox in England. Quakers opposed central church authority, preferring to seek spiritual insight and consensus through Quaker meetings, church meetings. They advocated gender equality. Why would you do that? Gender equality, and became some of the most outspoken opponents of slavery in the early America. Okay? Everybody with me on this one? I got to get to this before no, I'll get to this next. Okay, next thing. There's these two women that showed up in 1650 at Massachusetts Bay. It's Anne Austen and Mary Fisher. Two English women became the first Quakers to immigrate to Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were missionaries from Barbados. Shortly after arriving to Massachusetts, Austen and Fisher their liberal teachings enraged the Puritan colonists. I wonder why. They enraged the Puritan colonial government and were arrested and jailed for 5 years. Can you just imagine that? Wow. 5 years. In October of 1656, the Massachusetts colonial government enacted their first ban on Quakers. And in 1658, it ordered Quakers banished from the colony under penalty of death. Hi, you have to leave, but we have to kill you first. Ready? Welcome, Pentecostals. Everybody with me on this? Do you know why we call them the Quakers? This is so good. Because when they would go to pray and the Holy Spirit would come upon them, they would start to shake. And so they would sit there and they would pray like this, and they were quaking. So we called it shaking, but they call it quaking. And so they would sit there and they couldn't help themselves. And you'll probably see people today, when they get into the Spirit, they just sit there maybe like this. They're Quakers. It is the Spirit of God and how the Spirit of God moves on them. Now, I want to just be real with you guys. None of these things are really bad, except for obviously taking the scriptures and manipulating it. It was a way that God started to move with his people in the early church. And we just started to see a manifestation of it, which is a really big word, not a scary word. So manifestation just means it's now physically seen. Does that make sense? This is the birthplace of our churches, which I find absolutely fascinating because it's the birthplace of America. Massachusetts Bay Colony is basically the colony that starts to spread around North America. Other colonists did come in, but the established colonies that they showed up to were break-offs of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Why? Because it worked. Did you catch that? It worked, and it was founded off of religious ideals. I didn't say religious men, I said religious ideals. Did that make sense? I'll hurry this up and then get the band on stage. This is it. Boom, hurry up, let it go. 1650 to 1745, the colonists spread throughout the region, the focal point of each society. The religion was the focal point. 1745 to 1754, England wasn't the only in North America. After all, this was an enterprise, not a country. It was a get-rich-quick scheme. So guess who else is up there? Spain is up there. France is up there. The Native Americans are going, what happened? Does that make sense? They're confused as all get out. All they know is they're dying because obviously we're bringing in disease and things that we've never seen before. And then what's going on is now France is sitting there going, hey, I'm just trying to do the trapping thing, trying to do that. And England comes in and they said, forget this. And they start in 1756. They institute what is known as the 7-Year War. It's actually the First World War, if you guys actually want to get into it. It was not just fought here on America. It was fought literally all around the world, okay? It was England declaring war on the French over the entire world. They were tired of the French taking what England believed to be theirs. Did that make sense? Boom. Now, the colonists are now fighting the French. The French are fighting the colonists in England in this 7-year war on American soil. You guys with me on this one? You have the French and the Native Americans fighting the colonists in England. The war is over. England is the victors. We kick the French out and they become Canadian, okay? That's really what happens. They go north, okay? They become Canadian, okay? Now, when the war ended, with England being the victors, the war brought a devastating blow to England's economy. And since majority of the war was on the colonists, was for the colonists in America, Parliament wanted the colonies to pay for it. So they instituted a bunch of taxes on things like stamps and tea. Is this making sense? So, here's the next thing that happens. Okay, in 1764, the Currency Act was passed stating that you couldn't issue paper money. This made many colonists difficult to pay payments, and ultimately they were forced from their land. And England was coming in. Remember, the generals from England were coming in. They said, this is now mine. By the way, this is not new. The Jews had this happen to them because of Rome. This is not a new story. It's the same story, just redone again. Does this make sense? So now all of a sudden, people are getting frustrated. People are doing this. There's taxes without representation. What does that mean? That means there's nobody over in England going, hey, we don't want this. Does that make sense? So they're just getting taxed like crazy, and all of a sudden, you have an uprising. The colonies start to uprise, and then you start to see what is known as this. Boom. In 1764 to 1775, taxes were set. Okay, next one, bam! England started sending people over, but it was too late. And July 2nd, today, July 2nd, 1776, the day the Lee Resolution was voted on and passed. On July 4th, the document was signed and thus became known as the Declaration of. But it was actually officially voted in on July 2nd. Everybody with me on this one? Why is this important? Because of this line right here. Bam! We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Problem. There's this line right there that says that all men are created equal. Martin Luther King Jr. made that line famous because he said all men are created equal. See, what they're saying here is all men are created equal. As long as you're not a slave or a woman, you're good to go. Do you know the problem with the colonies? Most of them were slaves and women. Are you guys with me on this one? So what does it mean by all men are created equal? When it says all men are created equal, it's actually talking about the hierarchy society that England has with kings, queens, and noblemen. If you were born into a society, does that make sense? If I was born into royalty, I'm what? Royalty. I don't have to do anything. Does that make sense? I can't become royalty if I'm born poor. I can't do that. So when they say all men are created equal, what they're saying is you can come to this country, and when you're in this country, it doesn't matter what your birth was like. There's no hierarchy society here at all. Yeah, you guys are getting it now. See, over time, things have to adapt. Culture has to move. Matter of fact, if you guys read the Declaration of Independence, it gives 28 reasons why we need to separate from England. If you read it to today's standards, there's like a lot of them that we do today. What's the reality? Why am I sharing all of this stuff for you today? Band, you can come on stage. Why am I sharing all this stuff with you today? I wanted you to know where you came from. We stand on this land. We preach on this land. We talk to people, we work on this land, and sometimes we don't even recognize what it took to get here. My question for you is this: we would never be here without the men and women that literally fought for their communities. Did that make sense? They fought for community. They fought for their friends and their family so that they wouldn't die. They fought for freedom at one point. Are you guys with me on this one? What does it take for us as Christians to fight for the church once again? What is it going to take for us to sit back and realize that this is not just something that we do on a Sunday, but there is such a huge purpose for the community of believers? That we have a job to do. And it's not just to come and fill a seat on a Sunday morning or give a tithe or an offering. That our job is so much greater. It is literally the banding together of men and women to say, we can take this world on. Let's change it for the better. Listen, if this church was 14,000 people strong, and we didn't make a dent in this community, then we are failures. We can be 10 people strong, and we can go change a community. Does this make sense? I want us to get to a place where we have the zeal, the passion, and the justice in our hearts to say that there is a world out there that needs us. Why do they need us? Because we carry something that they don't have. And I pray that you understand that I'm talking about the Lord. Everybody you meet, it is an opportunity to share the love that you have. The problem is some of us, we don't get that love yet. We get it, I get it. Some of you guys, you're not there yet. But here's the thing, when you have that conversion experience, and you feel the Holy Spirit in your life, and you know without a shadow of a doubt that you are a believer, and that the Lord knows your name, then it's your time to go. It's your time to rise up. You can't stay silent anymore. I don't care if you're an introvert. You can't stay silent anymore. Why? Because there's something so deep inside of us that we have to let it out. When do we get that passion back? How do we get that passion back? Unless we recognize that there's something worth fighting for. I want you to fight for your neighbors, for those co-workers, for that cashier that's sitting behind the counter and you just know there's something wrong. I want you to fight for that guy that cut you off, that is speeding down the freeway, and you're sitting there going, what in the world's up with them? Maybe they have something going on in their life that they have to get to, and our job isn't to cuss them out, but is to look at them and say, God, wherever they're going in a hurry, God, I pray that you would be there. Are you following me on this one? It's a mind shift. It's a heart rendering, if you will. It's a reformation of who you are. Look, and you can go to the worst places. I know some of you guys are construction workers in here, and those are the places, and you're like, Craig, it's like cuss this, cuss that, blah, blah, blah. Look, I grew up with a construction dad. I know. I get it. I've been on construction sites. I know. You can still be a light wherever you're at. None of that matters. What matters is what's in your heart and the zeal that you have for it. So my plea, so you would sit down sometime between now and the next week, and you would get that zeal back. You would have that passion rise up, and that you could actually start to live out Matthew 28, which is the Great Commission. Go forth into all the world. Start to baptize, start teaching what the Lord has taught you, and know that He's with you. Listen, I'll be real with all of you guys. You were never promised glory in the scriptures. God never said that I'm going to magnify you. God never said I'm going to lift you up and glorify you. But He did promise one thing. He said, I promise you I'll be there. Your promise is His presence. And I hope that's good enough for you. Are you guys with me on this? So today, recognize who the Lord is. Go back to your roots and start to rise up and get that passion once again. And then let's go and make a dent in this city. Let's people know who the Lord is because of who you are. So Father, just thank you for this country and the men and the women that established it, for their passion, for their zeal. And God, I know that we didn't always make the right decisions and do the right things. But God, you worked through all of that. And now we're here today. And I pray, Father God, that this little church, this community of believers would go and impact the world. So Holy Spirit, continue to do a work and a wonder. And God, during the next few moments, would you once again, how to put it, reveal, rise up, reform a heart, and God, get that passion back in us. We ask this in your name, Father.